Thank you, Ray, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here. Unfortunately, I was teaching this morning, so missed a lot of the sessions, but the little bit that I caught demonstrated to me what an interesting group we have, and it's really exciting to be bringing together both academics and policymakers on an obviously important question. So my name is Niloufer. I'm a postdoctoral fellow in political science here at Albany, and as Ray mentioned, I'm very excited to be joining as assistant professor in political science in the fall. Before turning back to academia, I worked for a few years on a USAID project in Pakistan, and I also worked briefly for the International Crisis Group, and have since continued consulting with the United Nations Development Program. So I consider my interest right in the middle of the academic world and the policy world. And so I'll be speaking today, taking a step back from everything and just trying to give you a sense of my understanding of what we know so far about violent extremism, so what the state of the literature is, what questions we have answered, what questions remain unanswered, and then perhaps most importantly, what methodological tools are available for us as we continue to figure out the most effective ways of countering violent extremism. So let's get started. Earlier this month, researchers at Princeton and Yale universities released a study which tested the effectiveness of two popular tools intended to counter violent extremism. So these tools are livelihood training or skills training, which are intended to bolster an individual's skills and marketability with the end goal of improving their employment prospects. The second was a one-time unconditional cash transfer, that is the provision of cash to an individual, no strings attached. The third condition that the researchers looked at was a combination where respondents were provided both livelihood training as well as an unconditional cash transfer. So both these tools have been utilized by policymakers around the world, and a lot of money has been spent trying to train individuals and to provide them cash with the ultimate goal of having them step away from extremism and to limit their support of wartime combatants. The underlying theory is this understanding that poverty is somehow linked to support for combatants. And if we can change the economic prospects of individuals and improve an individual's economic prospects, this would make them less susceptible to insurgent recruitment. So what did the researchers find? Well, first, they found that while livelihood training did increase economic outcomes, it had no effect on the support for the government. That is, even after an individual is provided with training, even though that helped them improve their economic status, this did not affect how they felt about the government. Those individuals who received an unconditional cash transfer, initially, this cash transfer resulted in an increase in support for the government. But very soon, once the cash flow had been used up, this dipped, and the decrease in support for the government was replaced by an increase in support for the Taliban. So this is, of course, we can understand a worrying result, that the long-term effect of the cash transfer was an increase in the support for the insurgent group, the Taliban. The finding for the combined treatment, that is when individuals received both the cash transfer and the livelihood training, was the most encouraging. So it was these individuals who saw both a decrease in support for the Taliban as well as an increase in support for government. And they found that this result held even months after the treatment ended. So we should pause here when we look at these results, right? Because we have been using cash transfers and livelihood trainings with the expectation that these may help counter violent extremism. In this study, at least one of them had the opposite effect of increasing support for the Taliban. Now, all studies are, just one study, and we're going to be I'll be speaking a little bit later today about the limits of each methodology, and we'll be speaking a little bit more about the study. But nonetheless, we should pause here and think at least about the tools that we use in our toolkit to help counter violent extremism. And at the very least, we should think about what underlying theories we have in mind for what causes violent extremism. Because of course, ultimately, the tools for CVE are meant to address these causes. So let's take a step even farther back and think more about what we want to know about violent extremism. So what are academics and policymakers, what are they looking to discover? I think we can think of them broadly as two broad questions. So the first is, what are the underlying causes that I just mentioned? And even here, we can think of at least two units of analysis. The first is at the country level. So which countries are more likely to experience violent extremism, right? So why is one country more likely to see the rise or growth of militant groups and another country less likely to do so? At the individual level then, who is more susceptible to recruitment by militant groups, right? So who among us is more likely, when placed in a particular setting, to respond to recruitment efforts by militant groups? Second, and perhaps more importantly, how can we prevent or counter violent extremism? And even here, we have at least two and probably more units of analysis to look at. At the group level, how can we prevent militant groups from arising? Or how can we convince them to put down arms? And then at the individual level, how can we convince individuals not to join militant groups? So these are seemingly straightforward questions, and I look forward to having a discussion with everybody else on the panel today. What I'm going to present, though, is that worryingly, we don't have a lot of convincing answers. So let's start with what we know about the causes of violent extremism. We certainly have a lot of theories. So already I mentioned poverty. Poverty is one of the most, perhaps very intuitive and certainly a popular cause or theory that people talk about in terms of what drives people towards joining militant groups or engaging in violence. And most people point to two distinct mechanisms. So the first is that poor people are more likely to have grievances against the state, which increases their incentives to participate in warfare or rebellion against the state or to engage in other violent acts. The second is that poor people have less of an opportunity cost to participating because the lack of economic security decreases this opportunity cost. This is just two of the very many possible mechanisms that are discussed often in political science literature. However, the evidence for this is slim. So at best, we have some correlation that shows that people under the poverty line or people who have less economic resources are more likely to engage in such violence. But we also have a lot of worrying studies that point in directions against this theory. So for example, we have a study that found that graduates from subjects such as science, engineering, and medicine are strongly overrepresented among violent Islamist groups in the Muslim world, especially engineers. So how do we reconcile these two findings, or this finding with the theory, right? We also have survey evidence from Pakistan, which is the country, a part of the world that I study, and I'll be speaking a little bit about my work as well. And this survey found in 2010 that poor Pakistanis, particularly the urban poor, dislike militants more than middle-class citizens. So again, we have something that seems like a disconnect from the underlying theory that we often discuss. So my own research in Pakistan shows that this question is quite complicated. This past summer, I was working on a UNDP project discussing the reasons why youth are perhaps more susceptible to violence in Pakistan. And I found in many, many focus groups with youth that poverty or lack of economic opportunities did come up in conversation, but often it was the lack of job opportunities after employment rather than absolute poverty itself, right? And so there appears that there is some relationship, but the exact nature of this relationship is unclear. When I pushed my participants in these focus groups about this link between poverty and violent extremism, the answer was always the same, which is that this area, this part of the country, let's say Swat, has always been poor, right? Why is that today people are turning towards violent extremism? And so at that level, at the local level, people are recognizing, that correlation is not necessarily causation, and so there must be something else going on. Another often cited theory for causes of violent extremism is that of ideology. So again, this is a popular one among policymakers and academics alike. So for example, the former Prime Minister David Cameron was quoted as saying, "The root cause of the threat we face is the extremist ideology itself. The extremist worldview is the gateway, and violence is the ultimate destination." In my work as well, people have told me often that, and this is a direct quote from an individual that I interviewed this summer in Islamabad, Pakistan. He said, "People at times don't realize you can't just kill all the militants. What you have to do is change the narrative." And so again, he's pinpointing something that's more ideological, that it has something to do with what people are pushed to support for ideological rather than material reasons. Ideology, however, is largely an unpopular explanation among many scholars who view it as primarily a rhetorical device that can be reduced to some other structural variable. And even if we acknowledge that ideology does have some sort of role to play, why is it that some individuals are more susceptible to this ideology than other individuals? And so focusing on ideology as a root cause still doesn't get around this answer. So one example from my research is in Pakistan, when I speak with people about why individuals join violent extremism, why they support militant groups, an often cited reason is that anti-Americanism, which stems from the US's presence in the Muslim world, or its lack of support to the Palestine, or its intervention, or the history in Afghanistan, etc., is something that propels people to fight against the West or get engaged in global jihad. Here, though, again, why is it that certain individuals feel this compulsion and others don't? One of the reasons that I have studied in my work is conspiracy theories and why people are more likely to believe some conspiracy theories than others. Conspiracy theorizing is very directly related to anti-Americanism in Pakistan, because people assume that the US has a lot of nefarious goals and agendas, some of which may be true and some of which are a little too far-fetched to be true. But in any case, why are some people then more susceptible to conspiracy theories or more susceptible to anti-Americanism than others? And in the survey that I carried out a few years ago, I found counterintuitively that more politically knowledgeable people in Pakistan were actually more likely to believe in conspiracy theories in the country, which again should raise questions about what we think we know about the link between education and participation in violent extremism, or education and anti-extremism, etc. I could go on and on and on about the very many causes of violent extremism that have been mentioned in the literature. So for example, there's a lot of evidence to show that sources of rebel finance matter, or the favorable terrain that militants have, so a more mountainous area, for example. We also have people talk about income inequality, at the individual level, exposure to violence. So if I have been exposed to violence in my personal life, I'm more likely to want to engage in violence in the future. The presence of extremist groups in educational institutions, school curriculums, political disenfranchisement, ethnic or religious hatred or oppression, the absence of extracurricular activities and group-based activities. So these are some of the very, very many theories that have been put out there to discuss and figure out the causes of violent extremism. No one cause stands out, and of course, I think we can all agree here that it's probably because there is no one-size-fits-all policy. So just because something works in Pakistan doesn't mean it works everywhere. And also there's unlikely to be one answer, right? There's not one cause. It's obviously a confluence of many, many different things. But nonetheless, we still don't have a great sense of what these factors are. So what then, given that, do we know about what counters extremism, right? So if we don't, again, have a good sense of the causes, we probably don't have a very good sense of what counters extremism. And so let me just touch on a few things, given that I have about 5 minutes left. So let's go back to what I started the presentation with, like livelihood training. As mentioned, the Afghanistan experiment found that there was no impact on the support for government in Afghanistan. However, in Liberia, we had scholars who worked with a local NGO and found that an intensive agricultural training program increased participants' average wealth So it did have an economic effect, and it also decreased the amount of time that they spent on illicit activities. They found no effect on attitudes towards violence and democracy, however, but the lack of time or the reduced time spent on illicit activities should nonetheless be a win in some category, right, when it comes to CVE. So of course, one of the things is like, what is our dependent variable? What is it that we're trying to reduce? And this can manifest in a lot of ways: illicit activities, support for violence, support of the government, etc. Cash transfers, again, as mentioned, in Afghanistan, cash transfers in this recent project had the unintended effect of increasing support for an insurgent group once the cash ran out. In Uganda, a large-scale project found that grant recipients who received the cash did invest back in and so acquired skills and tools for their trade, successfully improving their economic situation. After 4 years, they had substantially large capital stock and 40% greater earnings than those in the control group. However, when these scholars returned to the field after 9 years, they found actually the difference between the control group and the treatment group was now negligible. And so there was a little long-run effect on income and poverty. So here we're not looking at what happens next with violent extremism, we're just looking at whether cash transfers themselves can improve the economic situation of people. And so we found that 4 years later, yes, but 9 years later, no. Creation of alternative narratives, right? If we determine that the cause is ideology, then what do we have to do? We have to create an alternative narrative that can counter this ideology. In Pakistan, I implemented a survey experiment which was trying to implement this theory called the common in-group identity model. The idea is that people tend to perceive themselves as part of an in-group, and they feel more positively towards that in-group than an out-group. But if you can recategorize people so they all feel part of that in-group, then you can increase tolerance towards members. And so, for example, in Pakistan, there was a religious minority, a lot of prejudice against the religious minority, but if you try to think of them all as Pakistanis, perhaps you can increase tolerance towards them on the basis of a shared national identity. And my survey found that it did increase tolerance towards that minority, religious minority, but only among those Pakistanis who were not themselves alienated from the national identity. Which makes sense if you think about it, because if you don't feel any affinity towards your national Pakistani identity, then regrouping individuals as part of that identity won't be successful either. I'm going to skip over this given the time limitations, and I want to end by just speaking a little bit about the methodologies that I mentioned over the course of the last 10 to 15 minutes. So the first is surveys and survey experiments. So surveys are really useful because they allow you to collect descriptive data. They also allow you to have large representative samples of people, so more than just interviewing one individual, you can collect the data about 900 people that is a representative sample of a particular country or a city. This is an advantage it has over qualitative research, for example. Survey experiments also allow you to isolate the causal effect of particular variables. So here, for example, examples would be, can religious clerics increase sectarian tolerance? So if a religious cleric were to say something about how Sunnis and Shias should live side by side happily, will that make a follower of that religious cleric increase tolerance or not? So survey experiments allow you to try and disentangle some of the causal mechanisms that are at play. Another causal question is, under what circumstances do voters penalize violent politicians? That allows us to isolate the causal nature of violence here. Of course, however, the problem with surveys is that there's always social desirability bias. Why would someone answer a question honestly when someone just shows up at the door and you have no relationship with them beforehand? What prevents them from just giving the socially desirable answer that, of course, I love all Shias, and of course, I love all Sunnis, etc. So that's one of the detriments of survey research. The gold standard today in development research and in political science is randomized controlled trials, or RCTs. So here the idea is you have a treatment group and you have a control group. They're equal, otherwise equal. You randomly choose them. You only administer the treatment to the treatment group. You don't administer the treatment to the control group. For example, give one group the cash transfer, don't give the other group the cash transfer, assess how they are a few years later. So this example that I mentioned in Afghanistan, this US-funded Introducing New Vocational Education and Skills Training carried out by Mercy Corps is an example of an RCT. This is all great in theory. They're incredibly difficult to carry out in reality. There's also the ethical challenges of what you do when you only give a certain group of people a treatment and not others. And then of course they're incredibly expensive. And often these are great in lab settings where you're trying to answer scientific questions. Sure, we'll have a treatment group and control group, but in reality, things happen, there's spillover effects, they're incredibly difficult to carry out well. I'm almost done. Large N data collection, so allows for cross-country comparison. It allows us to ask questions or answer questions like why Pakistan but not India, why Liberia but not Afghanistan. And so this is really helpful for us to take a step back from in-country studies and think about what it is happening at the global level. The problem with most of these data collections is even though they allow us to collect important descriptive and correlational data, they don't allow us most of the time to untangle the causal mechanisms at play. And then finally, qualitative research. So this allows people to get to know the actual context. So maybe not just go and work with Mercy Corps and figure out Afghanistan, but like go and study Afghanistan, get to know the people, talk to people, figure out the local context. What is it about cash transfers or what is it about livelihood training? Maybe that precise livelihood training wasn't the best one, maybe something else would be more useful. That sort of participant observation and ethnography is only possible in qualitative research. So to conclude, so there are clearly lots of questions about the causes of violent extremism that remain unanswered. Without knowing the causes, it's incredibly difficult for us to know exactly which solutions work and in which contexts. But it's not all gloomy, even though maybe that's what I've suggested so far, because there's no shortage of rigorous methodologies which can help us uncover these answers. And this is just to end on multi-method research is clearly the key here because it allows us to take all the best parts of the different methodological toolkits we have. Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.